The Unseen Haunting, Survivors' Chilling Encounter with Ghosts of the Past. Chapter 1. Echoes of the Fallen. Scott Staley was the kind of man who slipped through life unnoticed. In his mid-40s, he moved through the world with the careful precision of someone trying not to disturb the air around him. He lived alone in a modest apartment in Brooklyn, the kind of place where the walls held the whispers of countless lives before his. There wasn't much to his existence. Work, home, the occasional solitary dinner at the corner diner. He didn't mind it that way. Routine was safe, predictable. It kept the world at a manageable distance. His job as an insurance claims adjuster suited him perfectly. The monotony of assessing damages, filling out forms, and processing payouts was a comfort in its own way. Numbers and policies didn't change. They didn't ask for anything more than his attention. The work required a meticulous nature, something Scott had honed over the years, though it left him with a dull ache in his chest, an emptiness he chose to ignore. It was easier that way. But every so often, that emptiness would open up and the memories would flood in. Memories he tried to lock away, but that crept back into his mind with the persistence of a stubborn nightmare. The memories of that day, the one that changed everything, September 11, 2001. It had been over 2 decades, yet Scott could still feel the heat of the flames, smell the acrid smoke that hung in the air like a shroud, the screams, the chaos, the world collapsing around him. Those were things you didn't just forget. He had been there, right in the heart of it, and somehow he had survived. But many of his friends hadn't been so lucky. Scott didn't talk about that day. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said, nothing that could make sense of the senseless. Instead, he carried it with him, a heavy, invisible burden that had settled into the core of his being. He had learned to live with it, to bury it beneath the mundane details of daily life. Yet it never really left him. It was always the same time. Every night at 2:46 a.m., Scott would jerk awake, heart pounding, drenched in cold sweat. He'd lie there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince himself it was just a dream, just another one of those nightmares. But the echoes of that day would linger, distant, ghostly sounds that only he could hear. The distant rumble of collapsing steel, the cries for help that would never be answered. He was haunted, not by the dead, but by the memories of the living who hadn't made it out. One evening, after another grueling day of sifting through claims, Scott came home to find something unusual. He tossed his keys on the counter and made his way to the kitchen, craving the comfort of a cup of tea. But as he reached for the kettle, his hand froze midair. There, on the kitchen table, sat a wristwatch. It was an old, familiar watch, one he hadn't seen in years. Scott's breath caught in his throat. It was Mike's watch, his best friend Mike, who had been with him that day in the South Tower. Mike had always worn that watch, a gift from his father. The last time Scott had seen it was the morning of the attacks. Mike had glanced at it, grinning, saying something about how they had plenty of time. But time had run out, and Mike had never come home. Scott picked up the watch, his hands trembling. It was still ticking. The soft, rhythmic sound echoed in the quiet apartment, each tick a reminder that something was terribly wrong. This watch shouldn't be here. It shouldn't even be working. The face was scratched, the band frayed, but the hands moved steadily, marking time that shouldn't exist. He stared at it, a cold dread settling over him. This wasn't possible. He had never brought the watch home. It had been lost in the rubble, just like Mike. And yet here it was, as real as the floor beneath his feet. Unable to bear the sight of it any longer, Scott shoved the watch into a drawer, slamming it shut with a force that rattled the kitchen cabinets. He stood there, breathing heavily, trying to convince himself it was all a mistake, some bizarre coincidence. But deep down, he knew better. This was something else, something he didn't want to understand. Scott went to bed that night, but sleep didn't come easily. When it finally did, his dreams were filled with the sound of ticking, growing louder and louder until it drowned out everything else. The watch was calling to him, demanding his attention, pulling him back to a place he had tried so hard to forget. And as the night stretched on, Scott knew that this was only the beginning. The past wasn't done with him yet. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Dark. The days blurred together as Scott Staley tried to push the memory of the watch out of his mind. He drowned himself in work, forcing his attention on the endless claims that crossed his desk. But the unease gnawed at him, a relentless itch he couldn't quite scratch. He had hoped that by shutting the drawer, he had closed the door on whatever strange occurrence had taken place. But as the weeks passed, he realized that it was just the beginning. One evening, as Scott returned home, the dull familiarity of his apartment felt different, charged with a sense of foreboding. The space seemed colder, the shadows longer, as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. He hesitated before stepping inside, instinct telling him that something was wrong. But where else could he go? Scott flicked on the light and froze. On the coffee table in his living room lay an object that shouldn't be there, a pen. It was an ordinary-looking office pen, the kind you could find in any supply store. But Scott knew it wasn't just any pen. It was the one Matt, another friend lost to the tragedy, always used. Matt had been a stickler for details, jotting down notes in a leather-bound journal with that very pen. Scott recognized the deep grooves in the metal where Matt had anxiously chewed on it during meetings. He picked up the pen, turning it over in his hands. The weight of it was all too familiar, as was the slight dent on the side where it had once been dropped. Scott's heart pounded as he clutched the pen tighter. How could this be here? He hadn't seen it in years, not since the day the towers fell. The realization that this was another impossible object left him rattled to the core. Scott's hand shook as he placed the pen down, his mind racing with possibilities he didn't want to consider. The logical part of his brain screamed at him, telling him that there had to be a rational explanation. Maybe he had picked it up from work without realizing it. Maybe it wasn't even Matt's pen, just a look-alike. But deep down, Scott knew better. The connection was too strong, the familiarity too exact. Over the next few days, more objects began to materialize around the apartment. A half-burnt photograph appeared on his nightstand one morning, the edges charred and curling as though it had been pulled from the flames. The image was unmistakable. It was the last picture taken of his group of friends before the attacks, captured during a company picnic. Scott stared at the faces frozen in time, smiling, unaware of the dark cloud that loomed just days ahead. His own face stared back at him, laughing at a joke someone had just cracked. Mike stood beside him, the watch clearly visible on his wrist, while Matt clutched his pen, scribbling notes in his journal, always meticulous. The photo brought with it a wave of sadness so deep that Scott felt it like a physical blow. Then there was the tie, a crimson tie marred with a dark, rusty stain that Scott couldn't mistake for anything other than blood. It had belonged to Tom, the office joker, the man who could make anyone laugh even on the worst of days. Scott found it draped over the back of his chair one morning, the sight of it sending a chill down his spine. The tie was the same one Tom had worn on that fateful day, a fact Scott could never forget. The bloodstain was too much for Scott to process. He recoiled from it, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts as he shoved it into the back of his closet, trying to bury it along with the memories. But the objects wouldn't let him escape. With each new discovery, Scott felt the boundaries between reality and the past begin to blur. Shadows in his apartment seemed to move of their own accord, creeping along the walls and stretching out like dark fingers. At night, he heard whispers, faint at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but gradually growing louder until they became insistent, pleading. They weren't just sounds, there were words in those whispers, words he couldn't quite make out. Scott started seeing faces in his dreams, familiar faces twisted in agony, their eyes wide with pain, silently screaming at him. "Remember," they mouthed, the word echoing in his mind even after he woke, drenched in sweat. The faces weren't just familiar, they were his friends, the ones he had lost, the ones who should have been gone. The visions became more intense as time wore on, leaving Scott disoriented and frightened. He began questioning his sanity, doubting his grip on reality. Was it all in his head? Or were these objects, these impossible, terrifying relics of the past, trying to tell him something? Were they trying to reach out from beyond the grave? And if so, why? It was in the midst of this unraveling that David showed up on his doorstep, unannounced. Scott hadn't seen him in years, not since the memorial service. David had always been the strong one, the one who had helped pull Scott out of the wreckage that day. Now, he was a counselor, specializing in trauma, trying to make sense of the chaos that had shattered so many lives. Scott opened the door to find David standing there, concern etched on his face. The sight of him was both comforting and unnerving. David had a way of seeing right through Scott, of knowing when something was wrong, even when Scott tried to hide it. And Scott had been trying to hide so much. "Scott," David said, his voice gentle but firm, "I've been worried about you." Scott forced a smile, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm fine, David. Just busy with work, you know how it is." But David wasn't buying it. He stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over the apartment, noting the closed drawers, the shadows clinging to the corners. "You don't look fine. You look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." Scott felt the walls closing in, the objects in his apartment looming larger, more ominous. He wanted to tell David everything, to spill out the fear and confusion that had been eating away at him. But he couldn't. How could he explain the impossible? How could he tell David about the watch, the pen, the tie, without sounding like he was losing his mind? "It's nothing," Scott lied, waving a hand dismissively. "Just old memories. You know how it is." David didn't press, but the concern in his eyes didn't fade. He stayed for a while, talking about his work, about the importance of confronting the past rather than burying it. Scott nodded along, barely hearing the words. All he could think about was the next object, the next whisper, the next shadow that would remind him of what he was desperately trying to forget. When David finally left, Scott was alone again, the apartment silent except for the ticking of a clock that wasn't there. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the drawer where the watch lay hidden, his mind racing. The objects were piling up, the whispers growing louder. Something was coming, something he couldn't avoid. And Scott knew, deep down, that he couldn't run from it forever. Chapter 3: The Haunting Burden. Scott Staley's days had become a waking nightmare, a twisted dance between the past and the present. He could no longer find solace in the routines that once grounded him. Every object that appeared in his apartment seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, as if it were alive and watching him, judging him. The weight of guilt pressed down on him like a heavy shroud, suffocating any semblance of normalcy he tried to cling to. Survivor's guilt had been an unwelcome companion since that horrific day, but now it had taken on a life of its own, whispering insidious thoughts in his ear. Why had he lived when so many others had perished? What made his life more valuable than theirs? The questions gnawed at him, relentless and unforgiving. He found himself replaying the events of that day over and over, as if searching for a hidden clue, some reason that might justify his survival. But there was no answer, only the cold, hard reality that his friends were gone, and he remained. The objects that continued to appear had become more than just unsettling reminders of the past. They seemed to be demanding something from him, pulling him toward an unknown destination. He would find them in the most unexpected places. A photograph tucked into his coat pocket, Matt's pen lying on the bathroom sink, the blood-stained tie draped over the back of a kitchen chair. They seemed to move on their own, defying logic, as if trying to catch his attention at every turn. Scott's mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. Why were these items haunting him? What were they trying to tell him? He spent hours staring at them, hoping they might reveal their secrets if he looked hard enough. The weight of guilt mixed with confusion and fear, creating a toxic brew that left him on the verge of collapse. One night, Scott sat at his kitchen table, the half-burnt photograph in front of him, his fingers tracing the edges of the charred paper. He remembered the day it had been taken, the laughter, the easy camaraderie of friends who had no idea their days were numbered. His gaze drifted to the other items scattered on the table, the wristwatch, the pen, the tie. They were more than just objects. They were pieces of a puzzle he couldn't yet solve. Scott began to sense a pattern in the madness. Each item seemed to be tied to a specific memory, a moment shared with those he had lost. The watch reminded him of Mike's unyielding punctuality, the pen of Matt's meticulous note-taking, the tie of Tom's carefree spirit. They weren't random, they were markers of the lives these men had led, the lives that had been cut short. But what did it mean? Why were these memories being dredged up now? Scott's mind spiraled as he tried to connect the dots to make sense of the madness. The objects seemed to be pointing him towards something, guiding him like a macabre treasure map. But to what end? As the days turned into nights and nights into days, Scott's grip on reality began to loosen. The whispers that had haunted him in his dreams now followed him into the waking world, growing louder, more insistent. He heard them in every corner of his apartment, voices that shouldn't exist, but that he couldn't ignore. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were voices, clear and distinct, the voices of his friends. "Find the truth," they urged, their tones a mix of pleading and desperation. "You have to remember." But remember what? Scott's mind was a fog of fragmented memories, each one more painful than the last. The line between the past and the present blurred, and he began to question what was real and what was imagined. He saw his friends in every shadow, felt their presence in every room, as if they were reaching out to him from beyond the grave, trying to pull him into their world. Sleep became an elusive dream, and when he did manage to drift off, he was haunted by visions of that day. The fire, the smoke, the screams. He saw himself standing amidst the rubble, lost and alone, while his friends' voices called out to him from the darkness. "Why did you survive?" they asked, their voices echoing in his mind, a constant reminder of his guilt. Scott's descent into madness was slow and agonizing. He began to lose track of time, days blending into nights in a haze of fear and confusion. He stopped going to work, unable to face the outside world, and his apartment became a prison, each object a reminder of his torment. He barely ate, barely slept, consumed by the need to understand, to find the answers that eluded him. The objects continued to appear, each one bringing with it a new wave of terror. A torn piece of clothing, a broken pair of glasses, a charred business card. Each item was a relic of the lives that had been lost, and each one seemed to scream at him, accusing him of something he couldn't comprehend. They weren't just objects anymore. They were symbols of the burden he carried, the guilt that weighed him down like a stone. The voices grew louder, more urgent, their demands echoing in his skull. "Find the truth," they repeated, their words a mantra he couldn't escape. Scott felt himself slipping further into the abyss, his mind fracturing under the strain. The objects had become his obsession, his curse, and he was powerless to resist their pull. As Scott sat in the darkened apartment, surrounded by the remnants of his past, he realized that there was no escaping the truth, whatever it might be. The objects were leading him somewhere, guiding him toward a revelation he couldn't yet see. But as the line between memory and reality continued to blur, Scott feared that the truth, when it finally came, would be more than he could bear. Chapter 4: Secrets from Beyond. The days had blurred into an endless loop of dread. But as the whispers grew louder, more insistent, Scott knew he was nearing some kind of end. His apartment, once a refuge, had become a museum of his nightmares, each object a relic of a past he could no longer outrun. The watch, the pen, the tie, they weren't just trinkets, they were chains, binding him to memories he had tried so hard to forget. But now something had shifted. The objects seemed to pulse with a different energy, no longer just haunting reminders but guides, pointing him towards something he had overlooked. It was as if they were leading him somewhere, urging him to discover what he had buried so deep. It happened on a night like any other, Scott sitting in his dimly lit living room, surrounded by the artifacts of his torment. The old wristwatch had stopped ticking, the pen had run dry, and the tie hung limp over the back of his chair. But something else had caught his eye, something he hadn't noticed before, an old book, tucked away on the highest shelf, covered in a fine layer of dust. The book was a relic of his college days, a thick, leather-bound tome that he hadn't touched in years. He had forgotten it was even there. But now, it seemed to beckon him, its presence too conspicuous to ignore. With trembling hands, Scott reached up, pulling it down from the shelf. As he did, a small, yellowed envelope slipped out from between the pages, fluttering to the floor. Scott stared at the envelope as if it were a serpent poised to strike. His name was scrawled across the front in familiar handwriting, Mike's handwriting. He felt his breath catch in his throat as he knelt to pick it up, his heart pounding in his chest. How had he never seen this before? How long had it been hiding there, waiting for him to find it? With shaky fingers, Scott tore open the envelope, pulling out a single, folded sheet of paper. The words were hastily written, as if Mike had been in a rush. The date at the top sent a chill down Scott's spine. It was from the morning of the attacks. "Scott," the letter began, the ink slightly smudged as if Mike's hand had trembled while writing it. "I don't know how to say this, but there's something I've been keeping from you. I didn't want to hurt you, but I can't keep this to myself any longer." Scott's eyes scanned the page, his heart sinking as the truth unfolded before him. Mike had known about the affair, about the betrayal that had shattered Scott's marriage before it even had a chance to fall apart. His wife, the one person Scott had trusted above all others, had been unfaithful. And Mike, in his misguided attempt to protect his friend, had kept the secret, believing it was better that way. But there was more. Mike had been planning to tell Scott to help him confront the truth and move on. The letter was a farewell of sorts, a confession and an apology wrapped into one. Mike hadn't just been his friend, he had been his protector, shielding him from a pain that Scott now realized he had been carrying all along, buried deep within his soul. The final lines of the letter were a gut punch. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you in person, but I hope you can forgive me. And Scott, no matter what happens today, remember that you were always stronger than you believed. Goodbye, my friend." The letter slipped from Scott's fingers, drifting to the floor like a fallen leaf. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, sadness, betrayal, but above all, a crushing sense of loss. Mike had known. Mike had tried to protect him, and now Mike was gone along with the chance to ever speak those words aloud. The objects, the whispers, the dreams, it all made sense now. They were manifestations of his unresolved grief, his guilt, and the secrets that had been hidden in the shadows for so long. The objects weren't just reminders, they were clues, leading him to this moment of revelation, forcing him to confront the truth he had been avoiding for years. Scott felt a tear roll down his cheek, followed by another, and then another. He didn't try to stop them. The pain he had kept locked away for so long was finally breaking free, and with it came a flood of memories. Memories of Mike, of the friendship they had shared, of the laughter, the arguments, the quiet moments that had made up the tapestry of their lives. As Scott sat there, surrounded by the echoes of his past, he felt something shift within him. The objects, once so oppressive, now seemed to fade, their purpose fulfilled. The weight of guilt that had been his constant companion began to lift, replaced by a bittersweet understanding. Mike hadn't just been trying to protect him from the truth. He had been trying to give Scott the chance to heal, to move on. The letter had been Mike's final gift, a way to say goodbye and to help Scott find the closure he so desperately needed. And as the objects around him began to disappear, one by one, Scott realized that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to forgive, not just Mike, but himself as well. The apartment grew quiet, the whispers fading into the distance. The objects had served their purpose, the secrets had been revealed, and now it was up to Scott to decide what to do with the truth he had uncovered. Chapter 5: The Final Dream. Sleep had become a battleground for Scott, a place where the ghosts of his past gathered to remind him of everything he had lost. But this night was different. The usual terror that accompanied his dreams was absent, replaced by a strange calm. As he drifted off, he found himself standing in a place he hadn't dared to return to in years, the ruins of the Twin Towers. But this wasn't the chaotic, smoke-filled scene he remembered. The rubble was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. The sky was a shade of blue that seemed almost unreal, the kind of blue that only exists in memories. The air was thick with the scent of ash, yet there was something peaceful about it, as if the very place had finally found rest. In the distance, he saw them, his friends, the ones who had been taken that day. They were standing together, looking just as they had in life, untouched by the horrors of the past. Mike was there too, at the front of the group, his expression calm, even kind. Scott approached them slowly, his heart pounding not with fear but with anticipation. He had waited so long for this moment, and now that it was here, he didn't know what to say. But as he drew closer, the words came without effort. "Mike," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Mike smiled, that familiar lopsided grin that had always put Scott at ease. "Hey, Scott," he replied, his voice carrying the warmth of old times. "It's good to see you." The others nodded in agreement, their faces free of the pain and suffering Scott had seen in his nightmares. They were whole again, at peace. Scott felt tears well up, but this time they were different. These were not tears of sorrow, but of release, a long-awaited catharsis that washed over him like a cleansing wave. "I'm sorry," he choked out, the words tumbling over themselves. I didn't know how much I was carrying." Mike stepped forward, placing a hand on Scott's shoulder. It felt solid, real, grounding him in this moment. "It's okay, Scott. None of us blame you. We've all found our peace. Now it's time for you to find yours." Scott shook his head, his voice breaking. "But I couldn't save you. I couldn't." "You did what you could," Mike interrupted gently. "You survived, and that's enough. We've been waiting for you to understand that. It's time to let go, Scott. Let go of the guilt, the pain. Forgive yourself." Scott's breath hitched as Mike's words sank in. The truth he had been running from all these years was finally clear. The only one who hadn't forgiven him was himself. And now, faced with the spirits of his friends, he realized he couldn't keep living in the shadow of that day. It was time to let go, as they had asked. "Thank you," Scott whispered, his voice trembling with gratitude and grief. "Thank you for everything." Mike nodded, his smile never faltering. "We'll always be with you, Scott, but you have to move on, live your life. That's what we want for you." The scene around them began to shift, the ruins dissolving into a light mist that carried with it the echoes of voices and memories. Scott felt a sense of weightlessness, as if the burdens he had carried for so long were finally being lifted. He watched as his friends began to fade into the mist, their forms becoming less distinct, until they were nothing more than shadows, then nothing at all. But Mike remained, standing before Scott with a look of understanding in his eyes. "Goodbye, Scott," he said softly. "Remember us, but don't let us hold you back. We'll meet again someday, in a place where there's no more pain, no more loss." Scott nodded, a deep, profound peace settling over him. "Goodbye, Mike. I'll never forget you." With that, Mike turned and walked into the mist, his figure blending into the haze until he too was gone. Scott stood alone, the blue sky above him vast and endless, the ground beneath his feet firm and solid. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, feeling the air fill his lungs with a new kind of clarity. When he opened his eyes again, he was back in his apartment. The morning light was filtering through the curtains, bathing the room in a warm, golden glow. The objects that had haunted him were gone, vanished as if they had never been there. The air felt different, lighter, as if a storm had passed and left behind a clear, tranquil sky. Scott rose from the bed, his movements unhurried, deliberate. He knew what he had to do. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of direction, a purpose that had eluded him for so long. He dressed, taking his time, each action a conscious step toward closure. The letter from Mike, now worn and creased, lay on the bedside table. Scott picked it up, folding it carefully, and placed it in his pocket. It was a part of his story now, a chapter that had finally been written, and it was time to give it the ending it deserved. He left his apartment, the door clicking shut behind him, with a finality that felt right. The streets of Brooklyn were quiet, the morning just beginning to stir with life. Scott walked with a steady pace, his destination clear in his mind. Memorial was a place he had avoided for years, unable to face the memories it held, but today it felt different, like a place of healing rather than sorrow. He approached the reflecting pools, the water cascading into the void where the towers once stood. The names engraved around the edges were more than just letters. They were the stories of those who had been lost and the lives they had touched. Scott found Mike's name, his fingers tracing the letters with a tenderness that spoke of years of friendship and the bond they had shared. He took out the letter, holding it for a moment, the weight of it both heavy and light in his hand. Then, with a deep breath, he placed the letter in the water, watching as it floated for a moment before being carried away by the current. It was a final goodbye, a release of the past that had haunted him for so long. As Scott stood there, the sun rising higher in the sky, he felt a peace he hadn't known in years. The echoes of that day would always be with him, but they no longer held him captive. He had faced his demons, found the truth, and in doing so, had finally found the strength to move forward. With one last look at the memorial, Scott turned and walked away, his steps sure and steady. The past would always be a part of him, but it no longer defined him. He had his life to live, and he intended to live it fully, carrying with him the lessons he had learned and the memories of those he had loved. Chapter 6: The Locket's Message. The air was thick with emotion as Scott stood at the 9/11 memorial, the letter cradled in his hands. The world around him seemed to quiet, the city's usual clamor fading into the background as he began to read aloud. Each word from Mike's letter carried the weight of years lost, of a friendship severed too soon. And as Scott's voice trembled through the lines, he felt a connection reignite, one that had been buried under layers of grief and guilt. He read slowly, deliberately, allowing each sentence to wash over him like a balm on an old wound. The pain was there, raw and aching, but there was something else now. An understanding, a sense of resolution. For the first time in years, Scott allowed himself to cry, the tears flowing freely as he let go of the burden he had carried for so long. As he reached the end of the letter, he paused, the final words lingering in the air like a whisper. And then, in the silence that followed, he heard it, soft, almost imperceptible at first, but growing stronger with each passing second. It was the sound of their voices, the ones he had heard so often in his nightmares, but this time there was no torment, no anguish. Instead, they were calm, peaceful, telling him what he needed to hear. "We're okay, Scott. It's time to live again." The words echoed in his mind, reverberating through the stillness of the memorial. He felt an overwhelming sense of peace settle over him, a serenity that he had thought was lost to him forever. His friends, who had haunted his dreams and waking hours, were finally at rest, and now, so was he. Scott lowered the letter, his breath steadying as he wiped away the last of his tears. He felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, leaving behind only the memory of what once was. He took one final look at the memorial, his gaze lingering on the names etched in stone, each one a reminder of a life taken too soon. But today, the names felt different. They were no longer a source of sorrow, but a testament to the lives that had been lived, the friendships that had endured beyond death. As he turned to leave, something on the ground caught his eye. There, lying amidst the fallen leaves and petals, was a small silver locket. It was pristine, untouched by the elements, as if it had been placed there deliberately. Scott's heart skipped a beat as he bent down to pick it up, his fingers trembling slightly as he opened it. Inside was a photo of him and his wife, taken long before the world had shattered. They were smiling, their faces full of hope and love, a stark contrast to the years of pain that had followed. But it wasn't just the photo that caught Scott's attention, it was the note that accompanied it, one that hadn't been there before. The words were simple, yet profound. "Remember the love, not the loss." Scott stared at the note, the significance of it sinking in. This locket, this message, it wasn't just from his wife. It was from them, his friends, his lost companions, who even in death were still watching over him, guiding him toward the light. They were telling him that it was okay to let go of the past, to stop dwelling on the pain, and to start embracing the love that had once filled his life. For a long moment, Scott stood there, the locket clutched in his hand, his thoughts swirling in a mixture of sorrow and hope. And then, with a deep breath, he closed the locket and placed it gently back on the ground. It was a part of his past, a chapter that had ended, but one that would always be with him. As he walked away from the memorial, the weight that had anchored him to his grief was gone. He felt free, truly free, for the first time in years. The world around him seemed brighter, the colors more vivid, the air fresher. He knew what he had to do now. He had to live, not in the shadow of the past, but in the light of the present. His thoughts turned to David, the friend who had tried to help him, and Scott knew it was time to reconnect. He would reach out, take the first step toward rebuilding his life, one that was no longer defined by loss, but by the joy of living. There was a future ahead of him, one that he had been too afraid to embrace, but now he was ready. Scott walked with purpose, his steps sure and steady, leaving the past where it belonged, behind him. As he moved forward, he could almost hear the voices of his friends, not in mourning, but in encouragement, urging him to live, to find happiness again. And for the first time in a long while, Scott smiled, not with the pain of what was lost, but with the hope of what was to come. The echoes of peace followed him, a quiet reminder that the love he had shared, the friendships he had cherished, were not gone. They had simply taken a new form, one that would stay with him, always. And with that, Scott knew he was ready to begin again.